What happens when the most powerful country on earth starts losing the one thing that actually made it powerful in the first place? Not its army, not its factories, the world's trust in its money. That question is playing out right now, quietly, in numbers almost nobody is watching. And by the time it becomes a headline on the evening news, the shift will already be finished. Before we go further, I need 30 seconds of your time. This video took real research, real digging through data most channels won't touch. If you want more breakdowns like this, tap that like button now. It genuinely tells the algorithm to push this to more people who need to understand what's coming. And hit subscribe if you're new, because we're going to be watching this story unfold together, month by month, for the rest of this decade. Okay, let's get into it, because once you see this clearly, you won't be able to unsee it, and I promise it's worth the next 25 minutes of your time. Here's the story everyone is telling you about America right now. Too much debt, too much spending. A government that can't control itself. Turn on any news channel and you'll hear some version of the same warning, repeated in slightly different words by slightly different people. America is drowning. America is out of control. America is running out of road. None of that is technically wrong, but it's incomplete. It's the kind of explanation that sounds smart for about 10 seconds and then leaves you with nothing useful. Because debt by itself doesn't explain anything. Every country has debt. The real question, the one nobody on your television is actually asking, is this: why has the United States been allowed to borrow more than any nation in human history for 80 straight years without the kind of punishment every other country would have faced long ago? The answer to that question is also the answer to why things are changing right now. And once you understand it, you'll never watch the news the same way again. So let's start with where things actually stand today. By the middle of 2026, the total debt owed by the United States government crossed $39 trillion. To put that in perspective, that number is larger than the entire yearly economic output of China, Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom combined. And it didn't get there slowly. In just the last 12 months, the country added debt equal to the size of a mid-sized nation's entire economy. Let's slow down on that number for a second, because it's easy to read a figure like 39 trillion and let it just wash over you without actually feeling it. So try this instead. Imagine a family that earns a solid income every year, but every single year, without fail, spends more than it brings in and simply borrows the difference. For a year or two, that's manageable. For a decade, it starts getting uncomfortable. For 8 decades straight, it becomes something else entirely, a permanent way of life built on the assumption that the lending will never stop. That is roughly the shape of what the United States government has been doing since before most people alive today were even born. Here's the number that should actually worry you, though. It's not the total debt, it's the interest. The government now pays an average interest rate of just over 3.5% on everything it owes, which sounds small until you remember it's applied to $39 trillion. That interest bill now eats up nearly 1 out of every $7 the federal government spends. Within 2 years, that number is projected to climb toward 1 in every $6 or $7, depending on how rates move. Think about what that actually means in plain terms. Before a single dollar goes to the military, before a single dollar goes to schools, roads, hospitals, or anything else voters actually see and feel, a huge and growing slice of the entire federal budget is already spoken for. It goes straight to people who lent America money just to keep the lights on from last year's borrowing. And here's the part that makes this different from an ordinary family budget problem. When a family overspends for too long, the bank eventually says no. The lender stops lending or demands a much higher interest rate to keep taking the risk. That's how it works for you, for me, for a business, for almost every country on earth. But it hasn't worked that way for the United States, not for 80 years. And the reason why is the single most important thing most explanations of this story completely leave out. Now here's where most explanations stop. They tell you this is reckless. They tell you politicians spend too much and refuse to cut anything. Fine, all true. All. But that explanation treats America like it's just a person with a bad credit card habit. It isn't. It's something much stranger and much more specific. And to understand it, you have to go back more than 80 years to a decision made in a hotel in New Hampshire that most Americans have never heard of. In the summer of 1944, with the Second World War still raging, representatives from 44 countries gathered at a resort called Bretton Woods to design the financial system that would run the world once the fighting stopped. The decision they made was simple on paper, but massive in consequence. The US dollar would become the anchor of the entire global economy. Other currencies would be pegged to the dollar, and the dollar itself would be backed by gold. Think about the room where that decision actually got made. 44 countries, most of them still counting the cost of a war that had flattened cities and economies across 2 continents, sat down and essentially agreed to build their entire post-war recovery on the promise that American dollars were as good as gold. It wasn't just a financial choice, it was an act of trust on a scale the world had rarely seen before. Trust placed in a single nation's promise, backed by nothing but its word and its gold reserves at the time. The gold backing didn't survive the century. In 1971, President Nixon severed that link completely in a decision that stunned allies who had built their own currencies around the assumption that American dollars would always be redeemable for a fixed amount of gold. Overnight, the dollar became what economists call a fiat currency, meaning its value rested entirely on trust and government promise, rather than any physical asset sitting in a vault somewhere. Many people at the time genuinely expected the dollar's global status to unravel once that gold promise disappeared. But something strange happened. The dollar's role as the world's trusted currency didn't collapse along with it. It kept going. Oil got priced in dollars. International trade got settled in dollars. Central banks around the planet kept their emergency reserves in dollars. The habit had become so deeply wired into the global economy that even removing the gold underneath it couldn't shake it loose. Oil became the clearest example of how deep this went. Starting in the 1970s, major oil-producing nations agreed to price and sell their oil in dollars in exchange for security guarantees and access to American markets. That single arrangement meant that literally every country on Earth that needed to buy oil, which is to say every industrialized country on Earth, had to first acquire dollars before they could even fuel their own economy. That single mechanism alone created a permanent, built-in global demand for dollars that had nothing to do with how the American economy itself was performing in any given year. What that gave the United States was something almost no other country in history has ever had. The ability to print the exact currency the rest of the world needs to survive, and then use that currency to borrow from the rest of the world in the rest of the world's own reserve asset. Imagine being the only landlord in a city where every single tenant, no matter which country they live in, has to pay rent in your personal currency. You can raise the rent, you can issue more of your own money, you almost never have to worry about running out, because everyone else needs what you're printing more than you need to stop printing it. For 8 decades, this arrangement let the United States do something that would bankrupt literally any other nation on the planet. It let America spend more than it earned, year after year, decade after decade, without facing the kind of currency collapse or debt crisis that has crushed other countries who tried the same thing. Argentina couldn't do this. Turkey couldn't do this. Not even a country as large as Japan gets this exact privilege, because none of their currencies are the one the entire world is forced to hold. So here's the real story hiding underneath the debt headlines. America didn't just get lucky with a big economy. It built on purpose an entire financial empire on a single foundation, the rest of the world's need for dollars. And for a very long time, that foundation looked unshakable. Here's the uncomfortable part. Foundations like that only stay solid as long as everyone keeps believing in them. And belief, unlike gold or oil or land, can quietly erode long before anyone announces out loud that it's gone. If you're starting to see how deep this actually goes, do me a favor and drop a single word in the comments right now. Just type the word watching. I want to see how many of you are actually following this all the way through, because the next part is where the real picture comes into focus, and I read every single comment on these videos. So let's talk about what's actually happening to that foundation right now in real time, in the numbers that central banks report every single quarter. Back in the year 2000, dollars made up over 70% of every reserve currency held by every central bank on the planet. That was the peak of American financial dominance. Today, that number sits at roughly 57%. That's not a crash. Nobody's dumping dollars overnight. But it is a quarter century of steady, uninterrupted decline, and here's the detail that should really catch your attention. That decline has continued through Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, through booms and recessions, through wars and peace. When a trend survives that many changes in leadership and circumstance, it's not a political story anymore. It's a structural one. Something deeper is moving underneath the surface, regardless of who happens to be sitting in the White House at any given moment. Now here's a layer most coverage completely misses. Even that 57% figure is flattered by something that has nothing to do with confidence in America. A huge chunk of why the percentage hasn't fallen even faster is simple currency math. When the dollar's exchange value rises against other currencies, existing dollar reserves look bigger on paper, even if no central bank actually bought a single new dollar asset. Strip that accounting effect away, and the real appetite for dollar assets among the world's central banks has been shrinking even faster than the headline number suggests. So where is that money actually going instead? This is the part that should genuinely surprise you. It's not flowing into euros. It's not flowing into the Chinese yuan in any major way either, for reasons we'll get to in a moment. It's flowing into gold. For the first time in the modern financial era, gold has overtaken U.S. government debt as the leading reserve asset held by central banks worldwide. Think about what that actually says. These are not emotional investors. Central banks are some of the most calculated, patient, unemotional financial institutions that exist. They don't buy based on headlines or vibes. When dozens of them, across completely different continents and completely different political systems, will all start quietly stacking gold instead of buying more American debt, that's not random. That's a coordinated shift in judgment about where the safest place to store national wealth actually is. And the reason makes sense once you think about it from their point of view. Gold has no government behind it that can freeze it, sanction it, or use it as political leverage. Nobody can cut off your access to gold sitting in your own vault because of a diplomatic disagreement. Dollar assets, on the other hand, can be frozen. The world watched that happen in real time when certain countries had their dollar reserves locked out of reach, almost overnight due to geopolitical conflict. Every central bank on the planet watched that moment very carefully and drew the same quiet conclusion. If it happened to them, it could happen to us too. That single realization has done more to push central banks toward gold than any economic theory ever could. Trust, once you understand it this way, isn't really about interest rates or GDP growth. It's about whether you believe your money will still be yours tomorrow, no matter what your government decides to do politically. And piece by piece, that belief in the dollar system has been quietly tested and found less certain than it used to be. Think about how strange this actually is if you step back far enough. Gold pays no interest. It just sits there in a vault doing absolutely nothing productive. And yet, some of the most sophisticated financial institutions on the planet, run by economists with access to every model and every data set imaginable, are choosing that unproductive metal over the debt of the country that still runs the largest economy in the world. That's not a small, boring technical detail buried in a quarterly report. That is one of the loudest financial signals of our generation. And almost nobody outside of specialist circles is talking about it in plain language. And it isn't just central banks either. Everyday buying of physical gold by ordinary households in country after country has been climbing right alongside the official numbers. When the people at the very top of the financial system and ordinary families with no access to any special information start moving in the exact same direction at the exact same time, that's usually not a coincidence worth ignoring. It's usually a signal that something underneath the surface has genuinely shifted, even if most of the headlines haven't caught up yet. Now let's connect this to the debt number we started with, because these two stories are actually one story wearing two different masks. Historically, when a powerful nation's interest payments climb into that range we talked about earlier, somewhere around 14 to 15% of everything the government spends, at the exact same time its currency's global dominance is fading, history does not have a gentle example of how that resolves. It has never ended with a country calmly, voluntarily tightening its belt and everyone moving on peacefully. It has ended every single time in one of three ways. Default. Currency debasement, meaning the money quietly loses real value through inflation. Or a forced, chaotic restructuring of the entire financial system that country was built on. Rome is the oldest example. For roughly 200 years, the empire kept shrinking the actual silver content inside its own coins, while insisting the coins were worth exactly what they had always been worth. Merchants figured it out long before officials admitted it publicly. By the time it was common knowledge, the damage to trust in Roman currency was already permanent. Britain is the more recent example, and it's the one that should really give you pause, because it happened within living memory of people who are still alive today. The British pound was the world's reserve currency for roughly a century, the exact role the dollar plays now. At the height of its power, the British Empire controlled a quarter of the Earth's land and an enormous share of global trade. It seemed permanent, the same way American dominance seems permanent to most people watching this video right now. But 2 world wars later, after enormous debts and enormous strain on its own economy, Britain quietly handed that role to the United States. There was no single dramatic headline moment where Britain announced its financial empire was over. It was already over. The headlines just eventually caught up to reality that had been building for years. What's fascinating, and honestly a little unsettling, is that ordinary British citizens living through that decline mostly didn't feel it as one dramatic event either. They felt rationing. They felt a currency that bought less than it used to. They felt their country's voice on the world stage growing quieter year after year, without ever pointing to a single Tuesday when everything changed. That's what makes these transitions so hard to see while you're living through one. They don't feel like collapse. They feel like a slow, gradual adjustment to a new normal, right up until someone writes the history book afterward and finally connects all the dots you couldn't see individually at the time. That pattern is the single most important thing I want you to take from this entire video. These transitions are never announced in advance. They're never obvious while they're happening. They're only obvious afterward, to historians looking back, wondering how so many people missed something that seems so clear in hindsight. I want to give you the strongest possible version of the argument against everything I just said, because you deserve the real debate, not a one-sided story built to scare you. Here it is. People have been predicting the death of the dollar for over 50 years, and it has never actually happened. Every single rival currency has serious problems that make it structurally unable to replace the dollar. The euro doesn't have one unified government or one unified bond market standing behind it, which makes it fragile in a crisis. The Chinese yuan isn't freely convertible, meaning China itself heavily restricts how much money can move in and out of the country, which makes it useless as a global reserve currency no matter how large China's economy grows. And global oil, the single most traded commodity on Earth, is still overwhelmingly priced and settled in dollars, because switching that entire infrastructure would be incredibly expensive and disruptive for literally everyone involved, including America's biggest rivals. This is a genuinely strong argument, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Network effects in currency are real and powerful. The dollar remains dominant largely because the whole world already uses the dollar, and that kind of momentum is extraordinarily hard to break through normal competition alone. Think about how deeply this is baked into the system. The pipes that move money between banks across borders, the pricing of nearly every major commodity, the reserves sitting inside almost every central bank vault on the planet, all of it was built around the dollar over the course of 80 years. You cannot rewire something that deeply embedded in a single afternoon, no matter how many news stories declare the dollar's downfall this week or next. I want to be fair to this argument because it has survived a lot of premature obituaries. Commentators have been predicting the dollar's death since at least the 1970s, and every single time, the dollar found a way to remain the safest, most liquid, most trusted option in a world full of worse alternatives. That track record deserves real respect, not dismissal. But here's where that argument runs into trouble. It assumes the only possible challenge to the dollar has to come from another single country's currency stepping up to replace it. That assumption made sense for the last 25 years. It does not describe what's actually forming right now. What's emerging today isn't a rival currency trying to dethrone the dollar in a head-to-head contest. It's something stranger and, frankly, more dangerous to the old system. It's a rival set of pipes, new settlement systems, built on digital ledger technology instead of the old wire transfer networks that have run global finance for decades, that let any two countries trade with each other in whatever currency they both agree on, completely bypassing the dollar clearing system that used to be mandatory for almost all serious international trade. You don't need to kill the dollar to seriously weaken its power. You only need to make it optional for a large enough slice of global trade, and the old logic that kept everyone locked in starts working in reverse. The dollar stopped being optional because everyone used it. If enough major economies start finding it genuinely optional again, the whole self-reinforcing cycle that built America's financial empire begins to loosen from the inside. Let me make this less abstract, because right now this isn't a theory sitting in an economics journal somewhere. It's already happening in small, unglamorous pilot programs that barely make the news. A group of central banks in Asia and the Middle East has been quietly testing a shared digital settlement platform that lets them trade directly with each other instantly without a single dollar ever touching the transaction. India has signed agreements to settle oil purchases with certain trading partners in its own currency instead of dollars. Gulf oil producers, the same nations whose decision to price oil in dollars back in the 1970s helped cement the dollar's dominance in the first place, have started openly discussing pricing some energy contracts in other currencies for the first time in 50 years. None of this, on its own, ends the dollar's dominance overnight. But each one is a brick pulled out of a wall that used to look completely solid, and every brick makes the next one slightly easier to remove. This is why I keep coming back to the idea of a rival rail rather than a rival currency. Nobody needs to convince the entire world to switch to the yuan or the rupee or some brand new digital token in one dramatic moment. All they need is enough working alternative pipes that individual countries can choose, transaction by transaction, deal by deal, whether they want to use the dollar system or route around it entirely. And once that choice genuinely exists at scale, the dollar's advantage stops being automatic. It starts having to compete for the very trust that used to be handed to it by default. All right, this next section is the part I think matters most for you personally, not just as an interesting story about global finance. So stick with me here. If any of this is landing for you, share this video with one person right now, someone who watches the news every day and still hasn't heard this version of the story. That's honestly the biggest compliment you can give this channel, more than any like or comment. So let's talk about what happens next, because the ending of this story hasn't been written yet, and what comes after matters enormously for anyone holding savings in the currency at the center of all this. Before we go there, let's actually ground this in something you can feel in your own life, not just a chart on a government website. Every time the dollar loses a little ground, and every time the government has to pay a little more interest just to keep borrowing, that pressure has to land somewhere. It doesn't stay locked inside a spreadsheet in Washington. Historically, it shows up in the price of your groceries. It shows up in how far your paycheck actually stretches by the end of the month. It shows up in the interest rate on your mortgage or your car loan. Governments rarely announce out loud that they've chosen to quietly reduce the real value of their own currency to make an impossible debt load more manageable. They don't need to announce it. You simply notice, over a few years, that your money buys less than it used to, even though the number printed on your paycheck looks the same or even slightly bigger. That is what a slow currency transition actually feels like from the inside, long before anyone agrees to call it by its real name on the evening news. It doesn't arrive as a single dramatic crash that makes for a great headline. It arrives as a grocery bill that keeps creeping upward a little faster than your raise does. It arrives as a retirement account that technically grows every year, but somehow still doesn't feel like enough by the time you actually need it. Those small, cumulative changes are exactly how currency transitions have always felt to the ordinary people living through them. In every single example history has ever given us. Here's what history also teaches us, and it's a pattern that rarely makes headlines until it's already well underway. Governments that see their old financial advantages slipping rarely respond by simply shrinking themselves and living within tighter means. Politically, that's almost never the path of least resistance. Instead, they tend to respond by tightening control over the money that remains inside their own borders. Right now, more than 100 countries around the world are actively researching or piloting central bank digital currencies. These are fundamentally different from the digital money you already use through your banking app. A central bank digital currency is issued and directly controlled by the government itself, rather than by a private bank acting as a middleman. That difference matters enormously because it opens the door to money that can be far more precisely tracked, and in some designs, even programmed with built-in rules about how, where, or when it can be spent. China's version of this is already the most advanced pilot program on Earth. The European Central Bank has been steadily moving its own digital euro project through real legislative stages, not just research papers. The Federal Reserve has quiet research of its own underway as well. I want to be careful here and not overstate this. I'm not telling you a digital dollar is some kind of secret plan to control your life. That claim goes further than the current evidence actually supports. And I try never to tell you something is certain when it genuinely isn't. What I am telling you is this. A government whose old financial advantage is fading and whose interest bill is exploding at the same time has an obvious and completely rational incentive to want much more precise visibility into how money moves inside its own economy. That's not paranoia. That's simply what any rational institution does when the old, loose system it relied on stops paying for itself the way it used to. So the smart move for you isn't to panic about it. It's to watch the actual legislation as it moves through governments, not the press releases and PR statements that get published around it. Real quick, before I give you these predictions, I want to ask you something instead of just asking for a like. If you had to guess, right now, before I tell you mine, which do you think happens first? A major country openly ditching the dollar for a big trade deal? Or America's interest bill quietly crossing that 15% line we talked about earlier? Hold that guess in your head. Type it in the comments if you want. One word is fine. I genuinely want to see how many of you saw this coming before I laid it out. All right, here's what I think happens in order. Now, let me give you 3 specific predictions. Write these down somewhere and genuinely come back to this exact video in a year to check whether I got them right or wrong, because I'd rather be accountable to you than just vaguely right in hindsight. Prediction 1. The real underlying share of dollars held in global reserves, once you strip out currency valuation effects and look only at actual central bank buying behavior, will keep sliding through the next couple of years, even if the headline percentage occasionally looks stable because of exchange rate swings that have nothing to do with genuine confidence. Prediction 2. Within the next 18 to 24 months, at least one major economy will announce a significant bilateral trade agreement with another large economy that deliberately settles a meaningful chunk of trade completely outside the dollar system. Given current trends, this is most likely to involve energy trade, and most likely to involve some combination of China, India, or a major Gulf oil producer. Prediction 3, and this is the one I consider the most structurally certain of the 3. The share of the federal budget eaten by interest payments alone will cross 15% before the next full election cycle wraps up, forcing whoever is in office at that point into a genuinely public reckoning. That reckoning has basically 4 possible paths. Raise taxes significantly, cut spending significantly, accept meaningfully higher inflation as the quiet, less politically painful way out, or somehow grow the economy fast enough to outrun the debt entirely, which, and this part matters, has not been achieved by either political party in the last 25 years, and there's no serious structural reason to expect it to suddenly happen in the next 4. So here's what I'd actually suggest you pay attention to. Going forward, beyond just watching this channel for updates, watch the quarterly reserve currency data that comes out from international monetary institutions, and specifically look for any breakdown between raw valuation effects and genuine buying behavior by central banks, because that gap is where the honest story actually lives, not in the flashy headline number. Watch central bank gold purchases as they get reported, because that is about as close as you can get to a real-time, unemotional vote of confidence or a vote of no confidence in the entire dollar-based system. And on a personal level, the one that actually touches your own life directly, watch what happens to your own purchasing power while all of this plays out in the background. Because currency transitions throughout history have never been gentle for ordinary people who were still holding the old currency at exactly the wrong moment. Here's the thing that I think gets lost every single time this topic comes up in the news. This was never really a story about spreadsheets or interest rates or which country holds the most gold in a vault somewhere. It's a story about trust. And what happens when trust that took 80 years to build starts quietly leaking away. One decision at a time, one central bank purchase at a time, largely unnoticed by the people it will eventually affect the most. Every great power in history believed, right up until the exact moment it stopped being true, that its currency and its dominance were simply permanent facts of life. Almost like laws of nature. Rome believed that about its coinage. Spain believed that too, even while sitting on more silver than any empire before it had ever controlled. Britain believed it, right up until it found itself quietly handing the reserve currency crown to a country it had fought 2 enormous wars alongside as an ally, not an enemy. None of them experienced their decline as a single dramatic collapse you could point to on a calendar. They experienced it as a slow, quiet renegotiation of an unwritten bargain, the kind nobody bothers to formally record until, one day, so much has already changed that everyone can suddenly see it clearly all at once. And by that point, it isn't a warning anymore. It's already history, written in a chapter title everyone finally agrees on, long after the choices that actually mattered were already made. So here's the real question I want to leave you with tonight, and I genuinely want you to sit with it for a minute instead of scrolling to the next video. It isn't whether America collapses tomorrow or next year or even in this decade. That framing, the one you see on every panic-filled headline, is designed to grab your attention for 30 seconds and then let you forget about it completely. The real question is this. When the foundation underneath the world's most powerful currency quietly starts shifting shape, who actually benefits from making sure ordinary people like you notice it as late as possible? Because the most dangerous transitions in history were never the ones that arrived with a dramatic headline and a clear starting date. They were always the ones that had already been quietly underway for a decade or more, long before anyone in power was willing to say its name out loud. I know a video like this can feel heavy, so let me leave you with something a little more grounded than pure warning. None of this means panic. None of this means the sky is falling tomorrow morning. Slow transitions, by their very nature, give patient people time to understand what's happening and adjust their own thinking accordingly, long before the crowd figures it out and reacts all at once. The people who come out ahead in moments like this are almost never the ones who panic. They're the ones who simply paid attention a little earlier than everyone else and asked better questions while the story was still quiet. History rewards patience and clear thinking far more often than it rewards fear. Every empire, every currency regime, every so-called permanent arrangement eventually gives way to something new. And the individuals who understood that simple fact early were rarely the ones caught off guard when the change finally arrived in full view. If this video actually changed how you think about the news you'll see this week, that's genuinely the entire reason I make these. Subscribe if you want to keep tracking this story with me as the real data comes in over the following months, because I promise you, this is only the very beginning of this particular chapter. And before you go, tell me honestly in the comments which of the 3 predictions from today you personally think is most likely to happen first. I read every single one, and your answers genuinely shape what I dig into next. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.